There's a very interesting test to see if you are a sociopath. The test is simple. You read a whole bunch of random words, innocuous words, emotionally neutral words like tree or jellyfish or kangaroo or peanut butter. But mixed in these emotionally neutral words are some emotionally charged words like rape or murder or slavery. And the trick is you read the words, and people that are not sociopaths, when they come across the emotionally charged words, they take a little bit longer to process the words. They kind of pause like, da, 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 what the, da, 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 da. But sociopaths, they don't pause. They just jam through all the words without any emotional response difference between the innocuous, emotionally neutral words and words like rape and murder. That's how they can tell. That's one test to tell whether or not you are a sociopath. One of the interesting things that happened when they discovered quantum mechanics was what to make of all this data, how to interpret this. I mean, it's one thing to measure how long it takes an apple to fall out of a tree, but nobody is going to argue about what it means for an apple to fall out of a tree. I mean, I suppose you could, but it's kind of a silly argument when you want to collect the apples that are falling out of trees and you want to calculate where to put your basket when they fall. But for quantum mechanics, it's not obvious what it means. You do the experiment, you get the data, but you're like, what the heck does this even mean? So a lot of the arguments in the early days of quantum mechanics is what the data means, what this really means. And you have these big brain scientists not trying to discover the data, not trying to measure how the universe works, but they had the measurements, but it was an argument of what it means. And these arguments still persist today. On the basic level, what quantum mechanics really means is still something that people are discussing all over YouTube. One of the interesting ideas from philosophy and psychology is that nothing really has any objective meaning. Meaning is something that is subjective and is given to systems by humans. And a lot of psychologists have found that part of the process of living a healthy, successful life is to give positive meanings to events in the world. What generally happens is we see some event happening. We perceive the data, but then we give that data meaning on a subconscious level, and that meaning is always tied into our ego. It's always tied into our sense of self. And once you give something meaning, then that changes your confirmation bias. So whatever you see in the world validates your meaning. And when she started to train her students how to alter this in the brains of other people, she had a lot of success. But some of the experiments were a little bit questionable because the underlying theory is that most people have a very tenuous grasp on what life really means, and they're really being held afloat. Their ideas, their beliefs, their conceptions about themselves are being held afloat by the confirmation bias they perceive in the world. But if they meet somebody who has a very strong frame, if they meet somebody who has a very congruent frame, then it's very easy for the person with the congruent frame to outframe the person with the weak frame. And this has nothing to do with what is actually going on around you. This is why cult leaders are so attractive, not because of their external ideas, but because they are very congruent in their frames. They believe some crazy things, but the strength of their belief is stronger than the strength of other people's beliefs in normal, non-crazy things. In one experiment, she trained her students how to create a temporary, artificial, yet very, very congruent belief and go into shops and get massive discounts, sometimes getting the products for free, with a self-hypnotic collection of exercises to build in massive congruence. Combined with a little bit external linguistic trickery, they were able to convince the shopkeepers that it was normal to give stuff away. Now, this seems preposterous, but the belief that we hold inside is not based on logic. It's based on a collection of confirmation biases. But when you build a strong frame, when you build a congruent frame through this self-hypnosis exercise, and you combine your strong frame with some external linguistic trickery or manipulation or techniques, you can really, really easily outframe anybody to believe almost anything. And she was kind of excited when she just discovered how to do this. Not only when she discovered how to do this, but how she was able to teach other people to do this. How easy it was to learn how to do this, to learn how to augment your frame, to learn how to augment the congruence of your frame so that you can become incredibly persuasive with other people, so that you can become incredibly seductive to other people. And one experiment that ranks up there with the Stanford prison experiment as far as how unethical it is, she sent young men into various churches. And the idea was that you had these young women in these churches that are taught by the pastor that believing in Jesus and maintaining your virginity is the path to salvation. And she sent these young men in there to have a different frame, that the path to salvation is sexual promiscuity with strangers, to have sex with strangers. And they were able to take several young women who believed the path to salvation was virginity and Jesus, and translate that into a belief that the path to salvation is sexual promiscuity with strangers. They didn't follow through. They didn't have sex. They just wanted to see how easy it was to outframe people, which kind of makes sense. She discovered that if you have a pastor, a very young pastor that doesn't have a lot of followers, they're going to have a very, very strong frame strength, and they're going to preach whatever they need to preach to get a bigger and bigger flock, a bigger and bigger congregation. So if they start off preaching virginity and chastity and believing in Jesus, and as their flock gets bigger and bigger, they will have these ancient instinctive temptations for more power, and with power comes sex. So what ends up happening is you have these large mega churches, or maybe not quite mega churches, with the pastor saying things that are externally believable, like you need to stay a virgin, you need to give your heart to Jesus, you need to follow the 10 Commandments. But at the same time, they can feel the power coming from their congregation, which gives them a lot of sexual opportunities. So the bigger the flock is, the weaker the frame is that the pastor is going to have. So when she sent people into these churches that had a very temporarily congruent frame based on self-hypnosis, that the path to salvation is sexual promiscuity, they had stronger frames than the pastor who was arguing the opposite thing. Two opposite external ideas, but the frame strength of these young men were much more powerful than the frame strength of the pastor, which made it easy for them to seduce these young virgin women into having sex with strangers, and to seducing young virgin women that the path to salvation is sexual promiscuity. Like I said, this experiment is up there in its unethicalness as the Stanford prison experiment. But this is just an example of how powerful having a strong, congruent frame is, because frame is everything. And once you understand that the meaning we think is true, the meaning that we think drives our behaviors, is really an effect, not a cause. The cause is the strength of your frame. The cause is the congruence of your frame. And if you can temporarily even build a strong, congruent frame, whatever this external stuff is won't matter. Other people will start to believe this. And when other people start to believe this, you can exert an extraordinary amount of power over the thinking and the behaviors and the actions of other people. One of the problems they're starting to suspect about modern society is that more and more people are becoming sociopaths or sociopathic in their behavior because of social media and because of online dating. There's some professions that have a high percentage of sociopaths when they take these sociopath tests within these professions, like CEOs or surgeons. But the question is still unanswered whether or not these professions attract sociopaths or these professions actually make sociopaths. If you're a normal person and you become a surgeon, you have to get comfortable cutting people open when they're knocked out. You have to get comfortable with cutting people open that might die. So if you're not a sociopath, this job might turn you into a sociopath because you need to become a sociopath to be good at your job. You need to become a sociopath to be a better doctor. So the question is social media turning people into sociopaths? The theory is that before social media, before the internet, we had to interact with humans in a very, very real, very, very face-to-face way. And of course, we want to interact with people. We want to start conversations with people to get a good outcome. But sometimes you walk up and you start a conversation with somebody, but the outcome isn't so great. Maybe the other person is kind of boring. Maybe the other person has horrible breath, but you can't just bail out. You have to kind of roll with that until it has a natural end. So you have to develop this kind of sixth sense of, should I approach that person? And what if I approach that person, but they turn out to be a dud, or they turn out to be something that's offensive? And so you have to build this massive social real life calibration, but this is not happening on social media because people watch these goofballs on social media. People watch these goofballs talking about these strange things, and it's very, very easy to end the conversation if you suddenly become bored. It's very, very easy to end the conversation if you start to disagree with what this goofball is saying, but in real life you can't do that. So imagine if you did this in public. Imagine if you walked up to somebody in public and you started talking to them and they started saying things you didn't like and you said, you know what, I'm done. And you walked away. Most people wouldn't be able to do that, but you can do that on social media, particularly in online dating. And so the idea is that we're developing this habit of seeing more and more people as kind of expendable people. And we start to treat people in real life as expendable people. And that's exactly what hookup culture has done to our brains, is we see other people as only there for short-term pleasure, and we don't care what happens in the long term. And so it's very, very likely, there's a lot of evidence to support the idea that we are becoming much more sociopathic. We are becoming much more sociopathic in our behaviors with other people. And there's a lot of guys, a lot of women that are starting to realize that if you take on some temporarily sociopathic type behaviors, you can become much more successful, both financially and sexually. For example, there's a lot of people that are interested in becoming the dark triad. Because if you become the dark triad, not only will you make a lot more money in business because you can say whatever you need to say and people will believe you. In fact, a lot of companies today are built with these sociopathic ideas. These guys having these crazy ideas for a business, just as crazy as cult leaders' idea for joining the cult. But you say to this instead of collecting cult members, you give your pitch to a room of venture capitalists. And because you are a temporary dark triad, people believe that this crazy idea might actually be profitable, and they give you a ton of money. So these people that are adopting these short-term dark triad traits are collecting tons of money from people. And so people are starting to learn that if you even temporarily, through self-hypnosis, augment the congruence of your frame to adopt these dark triad traits, you can not only get more money from people, but you can have a lot of sex with a lot of people that you normally otherwise wouldn't have sex with. And this is a trend in society that nobody knows where it's going, and nobody really knows when this is going to end.